Okay, so welcome to the study of the rise and spread of Islamic fundamentalism in the 20th century. The question I want you to keep in the back of your head the entire time, and in fact it's just part of your assignment, is to figure out how did Islamic fundamentalism go from a negligible influence in the early 20th century to one capable of carrying out 9/11 and the creation of ISIS. So how do we go from a negligible influence to a more powerful one by the end of the 20th century? I just want to give credit where credit is due. Most of the information in this I received from several readings, but primarily the book by John Esposito, seen here, Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam. I have a copy in the classroom and a link on the Google Classroom to articles summarizing and actually most of the book as well. So if you're researching anything on this topic for your project, you may want to check these links out. Okay, so just to recap, Islamic fundamentalism is a group of people that believe in the urge to return Islam to the age of the golden age of the 7th century. In their mind, this is this society ruled by strict Sharia law, Islamic law. They tend to reject all things Western, especially secularism, which secular means non-religious, separation of church and state. The United States is constitutionally a secular state. They preach things like equality between the rich and the poor. They want to return women to what they see as a traditional role, which was pretty common in the 7th century, and they attribute it to a fundamental version of Islam. Again, most Islamic scholars, mainstream scholars, see this as a falsification of Islamic history. Okay, so to understand the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, we have to look at the time period when they were kind of actually negligible. So that is I want to look at the rise of secular, non-religious states after the Second World War. So just to recall, right, the last great Islamic religious empire was the Ottoman Empire, but it crumbled at the end of World War I, and in its place became the mandate system. Quick fact check, what was the mandate system? It was at the end of World War I, the European powers, coming off the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British, they set up a system of governance, kind of like colonies, in which the European powers administer the region and got Syria, Iraq, Jordan, all these places. They were to get them ready for independence. This dragged out for a long period of time, and nationalist uprisings broke out. And by the end of World War II, the Ottoman Empire is crumbled, and you have the rise of independent secular states. So the Islamic region gains its independence formally after World War II, much like India and the rest of the colonial period. Now, the new leaders who take over these countries are from Iraq, from Turkey, from their actual indigenous people, local people, but they are secular leaders, and they adopt mostly Western ways, and they actually try to squash a lot of the local Islamic culture. And they force that into the background. If you look at this is this is Ataturk, who was the president of the first independent Turkey. And if you look at him, he dresses Western. This is Gamal Nasser, who was the president of Egypt after World War II and into the 50s. If you look at these guys, these are Western-style democracies in theory, but they end up being very authoritarian as they try to hold on to power and create a modernized, westernized system. However, by the 1950s and 60s, it became pretty clear that most of these societies failed. These secular, non-religious states were either seen as too Western by some conservative religious folks. They were viewed by many as too authoritarian, where a small group of people controlled most of the power. They were seen as often corrupt, and often they were, where their leaders and the cronies would often pay off their friends, and while the masses of people remained hungry and poor. And speaking of poverty, the secular states failed to end serious economic problems in which the majority of the population was in poverty. So by the 1960s, you have the majority of this region living in poverty. And there was uneven development in which you had some people making a lot of wealth, others remaining behind. Also, in cities you had huge growth economically, but the countryside was often left in poverty, and what you would see sort of backward pre-industrial types. Now I want to pause for a minute. All right. So far, by the mid-20th century, did Western-style governments work? And the answer was no. Did nationalism, Egypt for the Egyptians, based on national heritage, not religion, did that work? No. These secular states, they seem to fail. Okay, so by the 1960s, many began to turn to religion. Now, this is when the Osama bin Ladens were like in their teenage or early 20 years, kind of formative years. They began to reject the secular nationalism, where country was more important than religion, and many turned to religion. They said, what makes us special, and this region special and unique, is our deep Islamic roots. All right. So as a pause point, what caused the rise and spread of Islamic fundamentalism? In many cases, the failure of secular states after the Second World War. All right. So the other thing we need to know in this region is the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. All right. The British ruled the Mandate of Palestine, the colony of Palestine, after World War I, and they promised not only Palestinian Arabs independence, but they also promised the Zionists, or the Jews who wanted a homeland in Palestine, they promised them a homeland with the Balfour Declaration. At the end of World War II, largely as a result of the Holocaust and the horrible treatment of Jews in Europe, there was enormous momentum to create this Israel, this Jewish state. And in 1947, the United Nations creates Israel, and what you see in the orange area is on the map there is the Jewish state, and the Arab territory was going to be in the yellow. In what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or the disaster, in 1948, many Jewish settlers seized land and removed many of the Arab Palestinians from the orange zone and sent them into the yellow zones, much like you have the Pakistan-Indian partition as well from 1947. All right, and so many tens of thousands were uprooted and sent to the yellow Arab state, and where they, to this day, their ancestors live in refugee camps. The Arab reaction was fairly swift and harsh on this. Most of the Arab states wanted to eliminate Israel as they viewed it as European imperialism. And you flash forward a few years to 1967, in what becomes known as the Six-Day War, Egypt and Syria mobilized against Israel, and Israel is surrounded by hostile Arab states, and so Israel preemptively attacks, taking over the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, over in this region here, and they win fairly quickly in 6 days. Since 1967, Israel has occupied all the yellow zones you see on the map there, and this is a huge point of contention for many settlers. All right, now, the big takeaway for this, though, is that the secular Arab states, those who rejected Islam and kind of were trying to be westernized, they were impotent, unable to stop Israel's quick and easy defeat. So groups would form, some of them secular, like the PLO here, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but more and more begun to turn to Islam. So the goal of groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization was to destroy Israel and create a secular democratic state in its place. However, factions start breaking off from this group and become using terrorism, and they start bombing airplanes and attacking sites in Israel and even in Europe and America that are sympathetic to Israel. So you could argue that the failure of secular states to create a powerful, comfortable Middle East, and the creation of the Jewish state, which seems invincible, led many to reject secular nationalism and turn to Islamic fundamentalism. After this war, right, the aftermath of the 1967 Six-Day War, remembered in Arab literature as the disaster, witnessed a sense of disillusionment and soul-searching among secular and Islamically committed Arabs. A lot of Arabs in the world said, well, what happened? Why can't we stop this? And this is quoting John Esposito himself in his book. He says, a quest for a more authentic society and culture emerged in the Muslim world, and this led people to turn. And in the 1970s, we go from failure in the Islamic world to success. Now, how so? The failure in the Six-Day War, and the Arab secular states are unable to stop Israel. They're really unable to stop poverty. They seem very powerless. But two things happened, two big moments, watershed moments in the 70s happened. In 1973, Arab powers place an embargo on oil and cripple Western economies and brings us to our knees. 1979, two things happened. The Iranian Revolution happens, which overthrows a Western-backed leader, and at the same time, these fighters, these Mujahideen fighters, which we'll talk about, took on Russia, and they won. And so Islamically focused groups really seemed to be able to take some power and gave credibility. Specifically, a war breaks out again between Israel and Arab states in what's called the Yom Kippur War, and the Arab states place an embargo. They turn off the oil to the West. And this has a devastating impact on the United States and Europe. And there seems to be this idea of these holy sites also seem to be where all this oil is, and they could use this to kind of bring America to their knees and our puppet states. This was a show of strength that really gave a boost of confidence to the Arab states, and again, if you look at this, they tend to be right in the heart of the Arab world and the Muslim world. if you recall, okay, in 1953, the United States helped overthrow the democratically elected leader, and we put this guy called the Shah of Iran. He's here toasting glasses with President Jimmy Carter. And through 20 years or so, the people of Iran faced repression under the Shah's rule, and he himself was overthrown in 1979. He fled the country. He flees the country and goes to the United States. We offer him protection, and the Iranian revolutionaries want him back to serve justice, and they're angry at us for offering him protection. They end up storming the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, and take Americans hostage. And out of this comes the Islamic Republic, which is still in power today. And many Iranians of that earlier generation, in the 70s and 80s, were very frustrated at the United States. And there's debate as to whether the newer, younger generation is as angry. But this is the Republic which we're talking about. But if you pause for that, right, why is Islamic fundamentalism becoming more popular? Is you have the failure of secular states. That didn't work. The Jewish state is created, and this has a religious element, but the secular states are unable to stop this. And the 70s have a series of successes, and we begin to have a movement away from secularism and a more of a religiously focused revolution in Iran, and religion seems to be coinciding with successes. Now, a couple other things. 1979, let's just recall it. The Islamic Revolution, it's in Iran, it's Islamically based, not secular, and it's able to stop an American puppet. The other thing that happens simultaneously is the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and they are defeated. The Soviets are defeated by an Islamically focused group. So let's take a quick look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and the Islamic group called the Mujahideen declares a holy war against the godless communists. And these Mujahideen fighters come from all over the Muslim world and rally in Afghanistan. They get huge support from these religious schools called madrasas. These madrasas are heavily funded by Saudi Arabia, which is flush with oil money, and they send these trained fighters, religious fighters, to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. The Mujahideen continues to grow throughout the 1980s with support from Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a grassroots Muslim organization throughout the Muslim world, and from the U.S. CIA. The CIA gives about $3 billion worth of weapons, missiles to the Mujahideen fighters in an effort to bring down the communists, the Soviets. Now, the Soviets, after about 8 or 9 years of fighting in Afghanistan, are defeated. The Soviets are finally defeated in Afghanistan by these fanatical religious people. And so this gives a huge boost to the pride and happiness of Islamic fundamentalists, and they continue to grow in popularity. Now, this is in the 1990s, right? We have... You have the rise of Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden, he was one of these key fighters against the Soviets, and so if you put that together, the U.S. was directly actually supporting Osama bin Laden as he fought against the Soviets. He forms a group called Al-Qaeda, or the Base, in the 1980s and early 1990s, and what another key event happens. Iraq, if you look at the map, Iraq in the center of the map, they invade this little country of Kuwait in 1990. Now, bin Laden offers his help and says, "Let me take on Iraq. They're invading too close to the Holy Lands in Mecca." Bin Laden is a Saudi Arabian citizen. He's saying, "Look, man, all my fighters will take on Iraq." The Saudi royal government rejects bin Laden's plea for help, offer of help, and instead turns to the United States. And American forces land troops in Saudi Arabia, the Holy Land, and push back Iraq out of Kuwait. This is where bin Laden kind of goes extremely angry with Saudi Arabia and the United States, and bin Laden declares a jihad against the U.S. and the Saudi royal family. Now, so keep bin Laden, he's kind of all around the world. He's primarily in North Africa. He's kind of hiding out. He carries out an attack on the World Trade Center in 1993 that fails. And meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, the Taliban comes to power. Now, the Taliban is a radical fundamentalist group. They came to power in Afghanistan in 1996 as the Soviets were withdrawing, and they give safe haven to bin Laden. So bin Laden goes in the 1990s to Afghanistan and kind of hangs out. It's in Afghanistan where bin Laden issues his fatwa, which is really only a statement that official religion officials could answer. He had no authority to issue a fatwa, but his followers followed along, and he basically says, death to America. We will carry out attacks to America and all their corrupt puppet regimes in the Middle East. And you have terror attacks on American targets in 1993, 98, and 2000. These are embassies we have in Africa, and actually one of our battleships in Yemen in the Middle East. All right, and then ultimately he orchestrates the 9/11 attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. So in response to 9/11, the United States invades Afghanistan in October of 2002 to not only get rid of the Taliban, but also find bin Laden. Now, for several years, we were unable to find him. We end up finding him hiding in Pakistan, in neighboring Pakistan, and special forces swooped in into his compound and killed him. Now, just to reflect on the terrorism in the Quran, we already studied this, but just to recap, right? Terrorism tends to be against the basic teachings of the Quran, at least according to Islamic scholars. The majority of Muslims believe that it violates their belief, and bin Laden and his followers and people like ISIS, they're usually coming from the poor, unemployed, and desperate social classes. They're disenfranchised and they see no way out, similar to why people join gangs. Now, the leaders sometimes come from educated, wealthy classes, but the followers tend to be poor and